Let me introduce our speakers. Again, I'm going to have to read. I apologise, I haven't committed this to memory. Robert Brotherton.
No, it's a myth.
No, he's not here. He was speaking earlier on. Jamie Bartlett and Carl are here. Yeah. Jamie Bartlett is the head of the, I'm going to have to get some glasses, the Violence and Extremism Programme at the think tank Demos. He researches and writes about a wide variety of extremist groups, and he recently authored a major paper on Al-Qaeda terrorism, which included living alongside radical Islamists. He's currently leading a research team conducting the largest ever survey of the far right in Europe. Carl Miller, I really do need to get glasses, I can't read this stuff at all anymore. Carl Miller is an associate at Demos and a researcher at King's College London. He's interested in extremism, dissent, the internet and social media. In 2010, Jamie and Carl co-authored The Power of Unreason about the relationship between conspiracy theories and terrorist ideology. Following this paper, both spent months debating with 9/11 truthers. So, without more ado, we'll let them speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, and it's great to see so many of you here. I guess in the absence of David Aranovich, we're probably going to be the two biggest figures of hate, because we also work for a think tank, which sounds rather sinister. But actually, Demos, where we both work, is an independent think tank, not party politically affiliated. We do research on lots of different things, traditionally education and health, probably above anything else. But for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working primarily on terrorist ideology and recruitment and strategy, but we have done some work, as was just mentioned, on conspiracy theories and the relationship that they have to terrorist ideology. So what we'd like to do is split this into 2 bits. Carl's going to start and talk about the paper we wrote and the reaction to it. Then I'll go on and speak a little bit about the paper that we're currently working on, which is obviously related to this subject. And we'll try not to be too long. I think it's quite important that we leave enough time for obviously some quite deeply held views in the room, and we want to get them out and talk about them. So I hope probably 30 minutes in total, and then that leaves us plenty of time for a discussion. Final point, if there are any journalists here, I don't know if there are or not, but if there are any journalists here, could you not use the material that we talk about? And if you want to use any of it, come to us afterwards and we'll talk about how to, because some of it is still not publicly available. And with that, I'll hand over to Carl.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so as Jamie just mentioned, I'm going to talk about The Power of Unreason, a paper that we published almost a year ago today, and the reaction to it. Not, I think, because we have some kind of narcissistic obsession in the way in which the things that we put out into the public domain are kind of understood, but because it's kind of, I think, a fascinating and very kind of crucial kind of micro-study in the way in which kind of the internet and kind of forms beliefs, kind of convinces people, allows people to convince. It's a kind of micro-study about certain conspiracy theory networks that we got ourselves acquainted with and got to know, and how they kind of work and how they influence people. So, by the way, I'd like to say as an initial caveat, I cannot guarantee that the stuff that both myself and Jamie are going to say today isn't going to offend people. It may very well offend people. I think the people that it might offend kind of know who they are in this audience, and I think that I kind of know who you are as well, because we've had some kind of run-ins before. And I'll just ask this, please. Please, let's not have a kind of run-in like we've had before with people shouting at us. We are going to leave ample time at the end for you to air your particular grievances, and we will deal with them as candidly and as honestly as we can. So, our story begins a year ago today when this paper, Power of Unreason, Conspiracy Theories, Extremism, and Counterterrorism came out. And you're probably wondering, why are 2 kind of like think tanker counter-terrorists kind of guys coming and addressing an event about conspiracy theories? Well, the 9/11 Truth Movement kind of had exactly the same kind of idea, and the kind of main understanding which our paper had was that in some sense we were trying to conflate all conspiracy theories with terrorism. What our paper did was to look at various extremist groups across the whole spectrum, far right, far left, ultra-religious, cult, and we found that there was a remarkable incidence of conspiracy theories working within these extremist kind of subcultures and these extremist group dynamics. We thought that essentially conspiracy theories played an important kind of social functionality within various extremist subcultures and groups and psychologies. And we kind of understood in the conclusions of our paper that conspiracy theories essentially within these groups kind of created demonologies. They kind of expressed and articulated a kind of folk devil, a demon, which the group was to hate. They were very useful, we thought, functionally, in allowing the leaders of such groups to kind of condemn dissent. Kind of dissenting voices within the group, especially defectors, are one of the most dangerous things to groups' cohesion. And the allegation of being in on a conspiracy against the group was used very widely by leaders across the spectrum to denounce and delegitimize kind of defecting and dissenting voices. They were also seen as, we also saw them as a spur to action. And if you look at a lot of the pronouncements and the kind of phenomenon of a group discussing within it, with itself about what to do, the idea of this kind of looming, sinister, yet somehow kind of unarticulated threat, placing pressure on the group, seeking to demolish the group, seeking to hive off members of the group from itself, very much was one of the most powerful and most oft-seen kind of reasons for that group then committing an act of violence. And kind of overarching all of this, the kind of finding of the paper, which I think is the most worrying of all, was that conspiracy theories in a wider sense, as a kind of social phenomenon, demolish trust between various conspiracist communities and the state and its agents which work on their behalf, or at least are supposed to. This was something which we became very interested in, the kind of the social phenomenon, the social performance of conspiracy theories, and how they kind of acted wider in society. Now, pretty much a year ago today at Goldsmiths, myself and Jamie were in a kind of a slightly smaller event than this, were being hollered at by a bunch of 9/11 Truth Movement, which we were kind of quite quizzical about, because the paper wasn't really about the 9/11 Truth Movement whatsoever. We really weren't trying to engage with the 9/11 Truth Movement initially. I think we mentioned the movement 4 times in the paper. One actually is an example of a non-violent terrorist group. I'm sure that quote won't be taken out of context. As a non-violent, non-terrorist group. Promise, cross my heart. You can download the paper if you don't believe me. So I just want to take us through a very kind of quick journey about how we got into that situation and what that kind of process we think tells us about the kind of the phenomenon of conspiracy theorizing online. So the first point is that the paper exploded on the internet. It was the fastest downloaded Demos pamphlet of the year. The blog which we set up to kind of try and deal with the action was, to the best of our knowledge, the most commented on blog in Demos' 17-year history. It was mirrored on thousands of sites. There are 100 pages of discussion. There are dozens of YouTube videos, all about the paper. Apart from the speed, it was interesting to see how quickly a kind of coordinated rebuttal campaign got into action. I mean, within several days, not the Demos site, but a conspiracist site was the highest ranking page if you search for our paper on Google. Now, I'm not sure if you know how Google works, but one of the ways in which it hierarchicalizes the various returns it makes is to look at which of the pages is most interlinked. So, frankly, Demos was being routed in the kind of link war online by a conspiracist site. Now, what we saw happening on the internet was that various groups, various networks, were acting in a way which kind of were quite hived off from the rest of the kind of mainstream discussion. We saw something which Cass Sunstein writes about called group extremity shift, which is where if you take a selection of people, has this been covered before, group extremity shift? No, okay, great. So if you take a selection of people that all kind of think the same thing, and you all put them in a room, and you get them to discuss whatever it is, whether it's capital punishment, or being a Republican, or, you know, whatever it is, they all, through that kind of process of spoken corroboration, everyone arrives at views which are more extreme through the confidence they gain through that corroboration than they were at the beginning. Now, we saw this kind of happening in these kind of hived-off groups that form this quite hardened kind of in-group, out-group mentality. There were very few kind of dissenting voices. So you had these kind of forum discussions and these comment threads kind of with a kind of cascade, a kind of avalanche of kind of criticism of the paper. And there were very few people, we thought, that were criticising any of the interpretations, any of the propositions or claims that these people were making about the work in the first place. So what we saw happening here within these hived-off groups, acting under these processes of in-group, out-group kind of distinctions and under the influence, we think, of the social psychological phenomenon of group extremity shift, was that kind of hardened truths, hardened preconceptions would form about the way in which the world works, about the way in which, how prevalent conspiracies are within it, about how power elites satisfy and the kind of aims and the goals that they have, how major policies are prosecuted. These had hardened into kind of received wisdoms, which, whilst I think in the mainstream these things would have been contentious, to say the least, within these hived-off groups, they had become something which was so true, so self-evident, that it wasn't really necessary to talk about them anymore. So in this context of these hardened preconceptions, we saw that elements, kind of like texts like our paper, entering into discussion, did so in a way which fundamentally distorted them. I mean, so our paper was kind of distorted to fit the worldview of these particular groups which were understanding it. So our paper became another nail in the coffin of freedom. It became, you know, another kind of step in the dark Orwellian plot to limit internet freedom, to limit freedom generally within society, to shut down on dissent and shut down on conspiracy theories. We called for open infiltration in our paper, which was understood as closed infiltration or various kinds of intrusion into these communities secretly to destroy them, to break up their cohesion, to introduce disinformation. We called for more critical skills for children, which became, I quote, Stasi schooling within one particular forum. We called for, I mean, the discussion generally was towards the counter-terrorist community, and yet we became guilty of painting all conspiracy theorists as being terrorists, dishonouring the families of the victims of 9/11, one person claimed. I mean, one of the most kind of common ways in which we saw this happening was through the kind of Orwellian deployment of doublethink. So, I mean, there's one YouTube video where you have lines drawn up from our paper, especially the recommendations, and then underneath what we really mean by the lines, right? Like this was how, genuinely, this was how the paper was being engaged in. And actually, strikingly, there were many people engaging with the paper and joining in the condemnation of the paper who also freely admitted not to having read it. So moving from this kind of general kind of atmosphere of distortion, myself and Jamie were ourselves then attacked. They moved on from the paper pretty quickly because, I mean, the paper, generally speaking, was calling for more government transparency, especially from the security agencies, and more critical skills to be taught so that people could weigh up competing truth claims, neither of which I think anyone in this room would disagree with, probably, I hope. We were attacked. We were called MI6 officers. We were called professional propagandists. We were called the PR men for the New World Order or the Zionist-occupied government and various things. Our interests, our integrity, our competence was discussed. Our backgrounds were gone into. I don't say this again. I mean, the interesting thing here is the use of ad hominem, is the use of this kind of interest-based argument. When these particular subgroups, these conspiracy subgroups, were trying to weigh up their response to the paper. Then Demos was attacked. I'm sorry that there was a technical hitch earlier. We don't have the Demos' logo up, and I was trying to. If you go on the website, you can see that the O is replaced by the Greek letter theta, which the creators of Demos thought connoted kind of insight. but unfortunately does echo the Illuminati all-seeing eye. Not something, I'm sure, which they anticipated 17 years ago, but when that was discovered, there was a whole new bonfire lit under the kind of criticisms. I mean, Demos's links with common purpose, with Marxists, with Masons, with Illuminati were all discussed.
There aren't any links, by the way.
the proposed links. I kind of want to round off the kind of discussion of reaction to our paper by the kind of, first of all, the insight in this kind of what I describe in these online communities to have a kind of self-aggrandizing siege mentality. You've got these hived-off groups. You've got these hived-off groups with with a certain set of propositions which have hardened conventional truths, which most people would consider, at the very least, very controvertible and very controversial. You have these groups which are engaged in a paranoid cognition, both within the group and outside of it. So they think that lots of people are trying to demolish the group. They think that people within the group are trying to demolish the group. You have these groups which use self-sealing arguments. So in the kind of ensuing months after the paper released, when we involved, I guess, in a kind of a bit of a debunking kind of exercise with these groups, we became aware quite quickly about how powerfully self-sealing conspiracy theory arguments are. One person wrote that the evidence proposed against the 9/11 truther claims, quote, demonstrates the determination of the perpetrators and their supporters to obfuscate the truth. I cannot think of any other kind of series of propositions on Earth where the evidence to the contrary is taken as evidence that the conspiracy exists. Also, purely the volume was incredibly hard to deal with. It's much easier to ask questions than it is to answer them. It's much easier to leave hanging questions. It's much easier to spot anomalies. Answers are difficult to make in a world which is complex and in a causality which is always fundamentally hypothetical. And frankly, we found it difficult to engage with the sheer volume, with the sheer number of criticisms, with the sheer weight of the conversation which was being thrown at us. I think underlying all this, though, we have a kind of and this leaves me with little optimism. We have a kind of fundamental impasse. Now, I guarantee that when I go home this evening, I will be able to find a conspiracy theorist's blog which claims whatever Mr. Crane says or says not today, that he sent the skeptics into rout, that he gave them real shellacking, that it was a real victory. And I'm sure I will find on the other side a kind of counterpoise number of claims by skeptics, whether today the skeptics won the day or not, claiming the vice versa. Now, I think it's always difficult when we have in society two camps which find it very difficult to speak to one another, when certain fundamental views about how the world works and how interest works and how people work really means that there are so few ways in which one can find overlapping common ground which can lead to a meaningful exchange of views rather than a kind of tit-for-tat shouting match. Again, a year ago, we were in exactly the same kind of context, exactly the same arguments, some of the same people, and I wonder, and I hope that Jamie's going to explore it in a bit next, how we can move forwards from this kind of flaccid, impotent debate to a way in which we, to find common grounds, both in the way in which we weigh up evidence and we weigh up competing truth claims, such that we can have a meaningful discussion. Lastly, and the reason I told this whole story in the first place is I think one of the things which is not being discussed, I think, as a society, and I'm not sure it's being discussed enough amongst the policy community generally, is the way in which the internet is such a powerful medium, or obviously the internet's a powerful medium, but quite what are the influences of the internet in the way in which we convince other people and are convinced themselves, the way in which we weigh up evidence, the way in which we form the way in which we acquire the information which creates our kind of foundational worldviews and beliefs. And it's on that note, I think, on this emphasis of the importance and centrality of the internet, I think, in the learning that we all do every day, that I pass over to Jamie.
What an articulate young man Carl is. Thank you. Yeah, so listening at the beginning of today to Rob's definition of what a conspiracy theory actually is, and then following some of the questions that were asked of those who felt themselves to be painted as a conspiracy theorist, it got me thinking. Because actually, the definition that you gave, which I thought was really, really good, Rob, I imagine most of the conspiracy theorists here wouldn't object to that as a set of problematic ways of evaluating, assessing information and coming up with conclusions. What they would object to is being told that their belief in, for example, the official account of 9/11 qualifies as a conspiracy theory according to that definition. So they would say, I agree with all of that, but I don't do any of that because I am looking at empirical evidence, and I know from some of the debates I've had with people, I'm looking at empirical evidence, I'm fully aware of the cognitive biases involved, I'm being skeptical of the government account. And so the problem is, actually, and we will come back to this, the problem is, when talking about conspiracy theories, I think we do need to talk about why some truth claims are better than others, why we arrive at certain conclusions and on what grounds and on what empirical evidence we arrive at it, and why we think that is a better way of doing it than another way. And I promise we will come back to that because I do think we need to. But I think something that we can probably all agree on, and Cole mentioned this, is the, casting aside any specific conspiracy theory claim for the moment, is the importance of careful, thoughtful, skeptical evaluation of evidence when deciding on an account of history or events that took place, how we arrive at those truths. Now, the fact is, many of the 9/11 truthers that I've spoken with have actually, to their credit, spent a lot of time going through information. They engage with it. They look for it. They go through the official account. They read the 9/11 Commission, which, frankly, probably very few of us actually have bothered to do. It's a huge document. They engage with that information, and for that, I'm pleased that they do. However, there is a rather foul-smelling legacy, I think, that has been left by the 9/11 truth movement, which is huge numbers of people that accept the 9/11 truther claims, but don't actually spend the time engaging with the information. It's just taken as a truism. It's taken as absolutely, you are so incredibly naive and stupid if you believe the official account of what happened that day. You're just a sheeple, you're being blindly led by the government, and so on. Now, that is something that I find deeply worrying and corrosive. Now, I don't have a problem with people engaging and being skeptical with both the conspiracy, with the official account, but it needs to be done as well for conspiratorial accounts. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In many of the communities that I work in, and particularly disadvantaged communities, and this is where I agreed very much with what Professor French said, there is a large number of people for whom it is just taken as a given that 9/11 was committed by the American government, Mossad, or whoever else. I find that hugely, hugely troubling. And I think what's required is, we'll get onto this, some better ways of teaching people about how they go about arriving at truth claims. And I'll give you another example. Has anyone ever come across the video, The Arrivals? Anyone seen that? This is a very, very interesting video. It's like 12 or 13 hours long, I think, which combines a strange set of numerology and mythology with Islam, connects that to New World Order, the second coming of a number of prophets, which has been roundly denounced by leaders within the Muslim community, but again is being swallowed up by large numbers of people, and I think it has a really serious effect. And I see that as being quite different from those people who genuinely spend a lot of time on this, thinking about it, engaging with it. And indeed, some of us are probably too gullible about when we believe some of the things that the government tells us as well. And I think some of us have been surprised by revelations over recent weeks and months about how our media has behaved, and are extremely pissed off about it, frankly. And one final example I'll give. Probably 6 months ago now, a company I'm working with called Bold Creative started running workshops with young people about how to critically evaluate propaganda online. And what they did was to fabricate entirely a conspiracy theory video that they'd knocked together about vampires and foxes in East London, and that there was an outbreak. There was I think a number of foxes that were passing rabies around into the human population, and then the government had tried to cover it up because there weren't sufficient amounts of vaccination available. They'd made the whole thing up and put it online, and very, very quickly a lot of people started jumping onto it and thinking it was a genuine video. The thing kind of spiraled a little bit out of control, but the whole thing was completely fabricated. And the point that I'm trying to get at here is clearly, even our friends who don't believe the official account of 9/11 will probably accept that there are some conspiracy theories floating around out there which are utterly nonsense and that people should not be watching and should not be believing in. And it's kind of those that I want to focus on. Just as some conspiracy theories are true, many of them are not true. And this takes me on to our new area of work. And this is where it links with Carl, which is about how the internet is changing the way that we create, access, share, and consume and understand information. Now, the majority of young people today, and actually all of us, frankly, get most of our information from the internet. That's where a lot of it comes from. That is such an incredibly transformational thing that's happened really over the last 10 years. I mean, every time that new sources of information become available, whether it's the printed press or the newspaper or the radio, there's always moral outrage and fear about what this means, particularly for young people. We're looking at when we're looking at the arrival of the printed press, a lot of commentators at the time were saying that young people were going to be overwhelmed with data and get extremely confused. And I think now what you're seeing is that multiplied by 1,000. There is so much good information now freely available to people, unmediated through the traditional the traditional gatekeepers of quality, so newspapers and peer-reviewed journals and all the rest of it, which is now available directly to people. More niche expertise, more e-books, more facts and figures, more ways of verifying data. I mean, it's incredibly liberating, but at the same time, that has been accompanied by at least equal amounts of absolute nonsense, misinformation, half-truths, lies, propaganda. And the fact is, it can be very, very difficult to tell the difference between the two. They often look very similar. They often have the same trappings. They might have the same academic trappings in some cases. But some of it's more accurate and more trustworthy than others. But the fact is, we're not really, I don't think, we're not really teaching young people as much as we should in this new environment about how to evaluate these different pieces of information. People, when they're talking about the effect that the internet is having on society, people like, Baroness Susan Greenfield are really worried about how it's changing the plasticity of our brain and all the rest of it, and that's very, very obviously contested if any of you have been following that debate. I'm more worried about how it's changing the way that people arrive at truth, and I think that where we are at the moment is in a situation where young people have more information available to them than ever before, but less and less are being equipped with the skills, at least some kind of epistemological rules of thumb to go about deciding between competing accounts. Now, you combine that with some of the stuff, and this was what really struck me listening to Professor French. Here's all those things that he put out as correlates with belief in conspiracy theories, so declining interpersonal levels of trust, trust in government, a feeling of powerlessness. I looked at that list and I thought, pretty much every one of those is increasing. It feels like every single one of those is increasing. The way that the world is working at the moment, all of those I can see them increasing over the next 10 years. I mean, we live in an increasingly unequal society with huge structural inequalities about how the world works, the power that people have within it, the feeling that people have about the sense of agency over their own lives and the major world events that are taking place around them that are truly transformational. You put that together, and I can see it just getting worse and worse. And at the same time, what we have is a partial opening of government. Government is being forced to open up by the new way that information is being shared, of course, but we're just getting little bits of it at the moment. And when you get little bits of information being released, it's very easy to link all of those together and come out with really quite inaccurate and problematic accounts of what's going on. And so I think when you combine those things together, the sort of the structural inequalities and the larger trends that are taking place in the world, with this new set of information that's completely revolutionized the way that people are receiving and consuming information, it's more vital than ever that we're doing everything we can to equip young people, and all of us, in fact, with those, as I said, epistemological rules of thumb. Now, I don't want to live in a world of sheeple where everybody just swallows whatever the government says, but I don't want to live in a world of arrogant cynics who do not believe anything ever, only what they find for themselves on the internet, because I find that to be at least as bad. So what I'd like to call for is just a couple of things to finish. I think schools need to spend a lot more time and effort teaching people about how they evaluate information they consume. As the traditional gatekeepers are increasingly obsolete and irrelevant in today's society, each of us becomes our own gatekeeper about the quality of information that we consume. And I think that's why we really need to be taught this a lot more. So, a couple of quick things. Firstly, it's just none of this stuff that I've been talking about, you know, critical faculties or skepticism, none of this is new. This is all obviously extremely old, and it's been going on as the basis of most Enlightenment thinking and classical philosophy. But we need to start teaching that much more in schools than we are doing at the moment. How you cross-reference certain claims. Why do you believe a peer-reviewed journal over a blog that someone wrote in their bedroom? On what basis do you believe that more? How much confidence can you have that that would be more accurate, and why? Accompanying that though, there are some particular new challenges that the internet poses to us. You know, how easy is it to create a website that looks extremely trustworthy and good? It's very, very easy. You can't always tell who did it, what their motivations are. You need to be careful when you go onto these sites. How easy videos are, and videos are an extremely powerful medium that, again, it's only been in the last few years that we've had such incredible access to videos, which are often spliced together, quotes taken out of context, deep booming music behind them to get people's emotions up. You know, these are things that are absolutely critical to know about, and a lot of people don't. The way that algorithms, I mean, you mentioned them before, the way that algorithms work. You know, I don't know the mathematical equations behind algorithms, but what I do know is that a significant number of young people think that Google arranges its search results in order of accuracy. Well, you need to know that that isn't true. You need to know that commercial companies can manipulate algorithms so that their searches come up higher. This is like the basis now of how we arrange information, and people need to know the weaknesses and the strengths of it. And then finally, talking about the natural weaknesses, the natural fallibilities that we have as human beings, the cognitive biases that we always fall foul of. Again, the internet hasn't produced or created any of those, but I do think in many cases it exacerbates them, because it facilitates the group mentality of having a closed forum that's password protected, where only the same people meet together and say the same things and link to the same websites, and it just creates this corroborating, sometimes group extremity shift within them. So I think it's more important than ever that people are aware of those cognitive biases, because you are going to be confronted with them on a daily basis when you go about your internet life. So we're beginning a bit of a conversation on this. We're doing some research into this, and we'll have something on it hopefully quite soon. And I hope that the way that information is changing the way that we are, in many cases, understanding the world around us, we can all agree that that requires a response in the education system to ensure that we are far more sceptical, discerning, and careful consumers of information than perhaps at presently we are. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have plenty of time for questions. Just a polite reminder of the question and answers structure. People here ask questions they answer them. So can we confine our questions to actual questions rather than statements? Can you form an orderly queue, please? That's the first round of applause I've ever had in my lifetime.
Hello, gents. Thank you. I didn't find you offensive at all, so thanks for that. Can I just say that I must agree with you about the education system, because as one of your conspiracy theorists, one of the things that most upset me when I got into this path at the age of 55, having trusted and thought the BBC was the best thing about the country and so on, was the fact that nobody had explained or had included in the education system the fundamental process of money creation on which our whole culture and our whole civilization is built. Now, this is something that people need to understand, I think, and it's something that dominates every other issue. And I would just like to ask you, do you think... but can I just give one little detail here about... sorry. But there was a program on television last year. Yeah, I will, but one second. This guy, there's a professor of economic history from Harvard, wrote a book called The Ascent of Money. And in that book, he did not mention the four most significant facts of modern history, in my opinion, when the Americans kicked out the Federal Reserve and started creating their own money. So I'd like to know, do you think this issue should be covered in the education system fairly?
Can we have more than one at a time? Because some of these are going to take a minute.
Okay.
I'm going to be extremely short. You're talking particularly... Sorry. Second speaker. Jamie, is it? No.
Jamie, yeah, me.
Yeah, you, yes. You were talking about how it's necessary to teach kids to evaluate information and how to deal with evidence and make up their own minds, and that's a process. I presume that you've been through this process in relation to the facts of what happened on September the 11th, since we seem to be talking about that mostly today. And can you tell us how you actually went about evaluating the events of that day?
Okay.
Yeah, one more.
Hi. As one who was present at the meeting last year at the Demos report discussion and helped organise it with the 9/11 activists, as you say, there was a certain amount of indignation in the audience. Could I ask you about some of the basic categories that we're using in that report, which are of great interest and importance to all of us? It seemed to me that they were not clarified, really, which might be why there was a certain amount of indignation. You talked about, for example, groups that endorsed violence or might in some way endorse violence. Now, there are various groups, like Marxist groups, anarchist groups, Islamic groups, that might conditionally, or Irish groups that might conditionally endorse violence. And I think it would be very important if your work had been over and looked at what those groups were. Now, another very general category used for groups to do with conspiracy theory was Zionist-occupied government. The idea that these groups all had somewhere at the back a theory of Zionic control or occupation of the government. Now, personally, I would suggest that Islamic groups, for example, do tend to have that view. But once again, you didn't bother to clarify which groups this actually applied to, as far as I could see. A third category you kept using was extremism. Oh, sorry. Oh, as far as I could see, you didn't define that at all. So I want to ask you, would it help if you'd just laid out what these categories are and seen to which groups they apply? You seem to be suggesting they apply to 9/11 truth groups, which I don't think they did really, and I think that might have been why you had a bit of an indignant audience.
Is this working? Okay, great. I'll just rattle through the two questions which were addressed to both of us, and I'm sure Jamie will do all three of them. The one about should the education system kind of foreground the all-pervading influence of money. I don't think we want to be making, I mean, I always pale at the idea of kind of putting some kind of mono-explanatory, mono-causal paradigm into education. I think there are lots of things which influence the way in which society works. I think today we were talking not about the various influences which people use to use their critical skills to analyse. We're just talking about those critical skills in a more kind of fundamental and abstract way. I hope that answers that question. Question 3. I don't understand what you mean by the categories we're using. We did distinguish between, I mean, at the front of our report, we have this massive table, right, where we've got all the extremist groups down one side and then all the conspiracy theories which they believe down the other. So we pretty much do match up the various conspiracy theories which are prevalent in all these groups specifically identified, including which of them are subscribers to the Zionist-occupied government and which aren't. So I don't really understand where there was ambiguity in the particular propositions we were making in that area of the paper. The idea that we were suggesting that somehow the 9/11 Truth Movement was a member of this family of extremist groups, I think we have dealt with at length, and I'm not sure that many people are going to be interested in us dealing with it again. But I think to précis our reaction to that allegation throughout the last year, it was, yes, we can understand why we were not clear enough at the beginning. We can understand why there was anger. We regret that there was any kind of ambiguity whatsoever in our mention of the 9/11 Truth Movement. And once again, I would like to wholeheartedly and forcefully state that I do not think the 9/11 Truth Movement as a movement is fundamentally violent or a terrorist one.
Hey. I think the lady's question was really important and one that we don't always address by saying that we're not talking about specific accounts or specific events, but the truth is we do need to come up with some way that we assess competing claims. And so why do I think that the official account, which is not really the official account, it's the account that thousands of independent journalists and researchers have come to, bears more weight and is more compelling than the alternative account? Well, firstly, I'm open to the possibility that a conspiracy took place, and if there was one, I'd want to know about it. I have no vested interest in trying to cover up a government conspiracy of any type. And it's the same for you, Cole, and it's probably the same for everybody that's been speaking here. I don't want to cover anything up.
I quite like a Pulitzer.
And that is actually an important point, which is there are thousands and thousands of researchers and academics that have been working on Al-Qaeda, that have been working, who are structural engineers, who are investigative journalists, who would probably love nothing more than to explode this story, the single greatest story in the history of the 21st century, but I mean, since newspapers began. But why don't they? Well, one of the reasons I think they don't is because the fact is, none of us know all the information about the technical claims made by structural engineers about how certain buildings fall, and we can't. We have to, in some senses, trust certain authorities and trust certain processes about how certain people arrive at truth over others. We have to do that in every day of our lives. We trust scientists that they can put planes together that won't fall out of the sky. We don't actually know how most of it works. Now, when I look at, for example, the way a lot of conspiracy theory accounts go about their business, I don't see a good scientific approach to this. When I look at the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, which is made up of hundreds of independent, trained structural engineers and others, they have no vested interest in trying to cover up a particular story or account. And then I look at the alternatives that are put forward, and I see a small number of anomalies that are pieced together. I see loose change making 3 or 4 videos. Each time their account is debunked, they come up with another load of claims, which are then debunked, and then they come up with another load of claims, which are debunked, and now the whole thing's stopped because they can't come up with anything else. And the fact of the matter is, I look at the empirics, so I look at that, I look at the process by which these people are arriving at their accounts, and then I look at it logically, and I think to myself, if the government were to try to orchestrate a false flag terrorist attack, why would it, for example, feel the need to wire up the 3 buildings, which are the most watched and filmed buildings in the world at that point, to bring them down in a controlled demolition to justify war? Was 2 buildings being flown into at high speed by 2 jets not sufficient reason to go to war? Did they have to actually come down? Why would you need to multiply the chances of you getting caught infinitely in order to bring the buildings down? It makes no sense to me. So on both an empirical and a logical claim, I find that the official account is more compelling. But that's not the reason that we arrive at claim. When you try
to Secret Service destroy their own building. Anyway, these hanging questions lead us absolutely nowhere.
Classifying all of their data. Do you realise?
I mean, the reports are openly available. There are hundreds of structural engineering reports openly available on the collapse of the 2 towers. Anyway, should we go on to the next one?
But can I say one more thing, though, which is another what I see as a huge logical fallacy, which is trying to find out who benefited from an event is not the same as presenting positive evidence about what actually happened. Otherwise, every single person that ever inherited anything when someone died would be instantly accused of murdering them. It's ridiculous.
Chris Parnell, current chairman of SPARES. My question is on a slightly different theme, and it arises from the massacre in Norway by Anders Breivik of a number of Norwegian Labour activists. When the news of the massacre came through, the Sun immediately assumed that the massacre had been carried out by Al-Qaeda and ran a story on it without checking the facts. It subsequently turned out to have been committed by a native Norwegian under the influence of far-right groups. My question is, if you'll try and deal with this, is how can we get the press to act on the facts rather than on untested conspiracy theory?
Give us some thinking time.
Hi. Jamie mentioned fragments on the net and the threat that comes when information is very fragmented and comes in bits that people can join together, and mentioned loose change. It's fairly out in the open that Google's business strategy involves personalization of search results. So increasingly, depending on who you are, you will get different search results. Now, no critical faculty teaching at school is going to manage to alter the fact that Google has this strategy. And if you do have conspiracy beliefs, you are more likely to have them confirmed on the web. So I was just wondering whether you have strategies in mind beyond critical thinking and more to do with managing technologies, being aware of business strategies, etc. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll say a couple of words. The reason the Sun newspaper immediately jumped to the assumption that it was Al-Qaeda was because there were hundreds of terrorism experts who had jumped to the same conclusion completely without thinking, without considering the evidence. And the fact of the matter is that since 9/11, there has become a bit of a cottage industry in terrorist experts who often don't know a great deal about the subject, don't include myself in that, but who are constantly looking for Al-Qaeda and Islamist-related terrorism, and who believe that this is the only threat we face, when there were lots of other very good researchers that obviously weren't listened to, who were saying, you know what, I think we need to be a little careful before we make an assumption about this being Islamist. And so I would put that down not only to the Sun newspaper's potential proclivities about reporting, but also the experts that it may have spoken to. I mean, good journalism is obviously based on a fearless investigation of the truth, irrespective of power and vested interests. And there is plenty of good journalism and journalists out there that are doing this. I mean, The Guardian's tireless pursuit of News International is a really good example. And to me, that shows why, you know, the journalists aren't trying to cover this stuff up. They want to uncover power and vested interests, and that's why they don't always get it right, but why, on the whole, I trust them more than a 16-year-old in his basement who's putting clips of YouTube together into a video. And I think that the personalization of search engines, this is something that other people have written about quite extensively, actually. There was is it Ellie Parser who wrote a book, I think that was out last, what was his name? Parisa, that was out maybe last year, I'm not sure if it was this year or last year, talking about that exact issue, that your search engine results are increasingly personalized and tailored to what they already know you tend to look for. And so you have, this is what I was saying in respect of Professor French's point, that it's not cognitive biases and corroboration and our efforts to, well, I guess the proclivity that we have to always find type 1 errors rather than type 2 errors is not something invented by the internet, but it's something that is certainly exacerbated by it, and the personalization of search results. Well, I think Google is actually trying, has it come up with a serendipity search, where it will just give you some random search results that you're probably not expecting, which is a slightly bizarre way of doing it, whereas I think just reading a nice selection of newspapers where you will read reports that you're not expecting, and where you know the biases of particular newspapers. So you go into it with your eyes wide open, whereas when you're on the internet often, you don't know what those hidden biases are. It's just presented there as fact. And so I think the only thing we can really do is to teach people about some of the dangers that personalization of your search results might have, that it might lead you into more corroborative information. You really should go try and check out some other sites as well. And I can't really see what else we can actually do, frankly.
Yeah, just on the serendipity search by Google, unfortunately, that is Google's actual premise there is that the serendipity will be based on them knowing more about the things that you were searching for than you do. As in, they know you better than you know yourself, essentially. So, yeah, we see these, I mean, Eli Parisa calls this kind of invisible auto-propaganda. The idea of filter bubbles is something which we see very much in social networks. People like Ethan Zuckerman have done very compelling research into how, when we form social networks, especially online, we pick people who are very like ourselves, very similar to ourselves, socio-demographically, to be part of our networks. So I do think we have this, the idea of these echo chambers, I think exists in all different aspects of society. I think we're all kind of subject and in danger of them. As we are all in danger of labouring under hardened preconceptions. And as Jamie just said, yeah, absolutely, the idea that there were certain preconceptions about who conducts terrorist attacks, and these were acted on, regarding the Norway attacks, I think is absolutely clear. I'd like to say that my paper on how to fix British media will be out soon, so... I mean, it's obviously a huge problem. There's obviously this kind of industry pressures about printing stories in the British press that have nothing to do with that have nothing to do with the facts that they currently have. I wish I knew how to fix newspapers that did that. I don't, unfortunately.
But at least we have, at least we have libel laws that mean that journalists are operating under some sort of discipline about getting towards the truth. And those libel laws often don't exist at all in any form on the internet.
Hiya. My question's just about when you were saying teaching children how to evaluate evidence on the internet. I definitely think it's a good idea to teach children how to evaluate evidence, but as regards to the internet, I only left school 6 years ago, and what I got taught about the internet is already irrelevant. How are you wanting to project how you teach about future technologies and how to evaluate those, basically? What are the plans to foresee what's going to happen and how to teach within that.
It's easy to say to do that, but it's actually not. It's so easy to do, yeah.
You said you were interested in finding common ground and moving forward. I would say there was two main issues you touched upon, and they're separate things, and they need to be kept separate from each other at all times.